But first, we should talk about the Edmonton Oilers, a team that at the beginning of the year we had a lot of high hopes for, and they had a terrible start to their year. They have since rebounded, winners of 7 in a row. They are level with the Calgary Flames on points, with the tied for fourth best in the Pacific, only a couple points off of a wild card playoff spot right now. I was just curious, what do you make of the Edmonton Oilers doing everything they can to salvage their year and make it into the playoffs? Just before New Year's, they look like a completely new team.
Yeah, I mean, they've almost completely erased, I guess, the hole that they dug themselves. The wasn't just a hole, was it like the Grand Canyon of holes that the Oilers were in, early in the season. And I don't know how to view this. Look, we talked about this team at the start of the year. I think we're both on the same page that certainly they were a cup contender, if not a favorite,
Mm-hmm.
depending on how you viewed it. I was just surprised to see them hit the depths they did within the first, 6 weeks of the season. I'm a little less surprised to see where they are now. And what a strange year of extremes already for that organization. But I think that the high level takeaway from me, Julian, is that they can now just kind of play. Like, I realize they're not in a playoff position as of this minute, but that they're close enough touch of one that I think that they don't have to stress over every 2-game losing streak that might come along. I think if they just do their thing, basically win somewhere close to 2 out of every 3 games, or 3 out of every 5, maybe statistically, that they're probably going to be okay. And the thing that jumps out the most, I mean, there's been a coaching change. Some other things have gone on, but you're seeing Connor McDavid in particular just light the world on fire. I mean, at one point earlier this year in November, he was like 90th in league scoring. He jumped into the top 10 with like a monster week, and he's. I'm not saying that he's single-handedly lifted them to all these wins, but certainly he's been a big driving force behind a lot of success for the Oilers. And him looking like himself again, I think, is most encouraging, because we do know he was playing at less than 100% earlier in the season, and maybe they did have a pretty big break in the schedule there. Actually, time for Connor McDavid to fly back to Toronto and take a spot on Canada's Walk of Fame
Yeah.
in the middle of the season. And you just wonder maybe if some of that time off has either refreshed his body or mind. But yeah, everything's cooking again in Edmonton.
And to your point about that time off, some teams above them in the standings right now, the St. Louis Blues, 2 points ahead of them, Arizona and Nashville in wildcard spots. Edmonton has a game in hand on Arizona. They have 3 games in hand on Nashville. They have 2 games in hand on St. Louis. That time off, I mean, they could make up some of that ground. And if they win some of those games and some of those other teams fall off, I'm telling you, like, this team could put itself back into a playoff position where we all expected they would be. It's a remarkable, like, first half season turnaround. I can't think of any other team that's done anything like that, if they actually do this.
Well, they just plummeted basically straight to the bottom of the standings, where no one ever thought they'd spend even one day, let alone a couple weeks, and then they've ripped right back up into the middle of the pack. And it won't surprise me if they just go and have the kind of regular season from this point on we would have expected them to have, and make the playoffs comfortably. And we'll probably talk about how there were some positives about the way the season started. I mean, certainly nothing positive about having a couple coaches fired behind the bench. But I just mean in terms of maybe bringing the group together, that they really they went through some things in the early going, and maybe they've found a way to pull themselves out of it. Um, it's weird. I mean, sports are so strange in terms of how you end up in this spot, but I still think Edmonton is a team that will look for goaltending as time goes along. I mean, here's another factor, right? That it's just taking some heat off the idea that you have to make this move today just to make a move. That's sort of what I was saying even too. I don't think they need to be fixated on the standings just yet. You almost needed the 7-game win streak though to counterbalance how bad the start was. Because remember at that time, everyone was doing that. They need to play at a 106-point pace from here on in to just make the playoffs, all those sort of numbers. Well, now they don't have to do that. Now you've won 7 in a row. You almost just like throw everything out together. And you're like, okay, we're somewhere we want to be. And I think they can just go play. And the West is a weird conference again this year. Like there's a couple teams at the very bottom that look to be quite bad. I'm looking at, Chicago. I know San Jose's won some games, but don't think it's going to be a great year there. I mean, Seattle's been a little puzzling in terms of just, how far back they are. I just think there's lots of runway here for Edmonton to cruise into the playoffs. And then obviously they got to figure out how they're going to get through teams like LA or Vegas, who look like they're going to be strong once again as we get into the second half of the season soon.
You mentioned Chicago. A fascinating game tomorrow between the Chicago Blackhawks and the Edmonton Oilers. We get our first Connor versus Connor. We get Connor McDavid and Connor Bedard against each other. There's a good piece up on the Athletic website. Could Connor McDavid and Connor Bedard forge the NHL's next great rivalry? You should check that out. Mark Lazarus and Daniel Nugent-Bowman put that together. What do you make of Connor versus Connor? What do you make of that matchup? The superstar potential in both of those Connors playing against each other. I've said Connor a lot, by the way, the last few moments.
It's funny. I've covered a lot of these type of games in my career, and there's like certainly a lot of curiosity there, right? Like when you have two of the most supremely gifted offensive players on the ice in one game on opposite sides. I mean, it would be like going back in time and seeing a Gretzky versus Lemieux game or something of that nature. It's probably much cooler for Connor Bedard, if we're being honest, just because he grew up watching Connor McDavid. And, while he's had his first tour around the NHL here, he's, seen other stars, including Sidney Crosby and others, Austin Matthews, that he's played against already this year. I think there'll be something special about that. Whether or not this becomes a rivalry, I think the jury's out. I mean, we need to align like the moon and the stars where, we're talking about Chicago becoming a Stanley Cup contender and somewhere in the near-ish future and Edmonton remaining one. I'm not saying it won't happen. It's just right now, there's no rivalry between the teams. But I mean, that would be pretty cool, right? I mean, you're talking about you want to see like Magic and Bird in the final against each other, right? Or could have been Gretzky Lemieux. They never played in a final against each other, but stuff like that. That's sort of where those rivalries are made. I mean, the Crosby Ovechkin thing was a rivalry because they entered the league at the same time. Obviously, they almost took turns winning the major awards early in their careers, but then the Penguins and Capitals played 4 or 5 times in the playoffs and played game sevens against each other. They had dueling hat trick games with Crosby Ovechkin. That's what made that rivalry more than just a media created thing. I think that there was a genuine rivalry because the teams were standing in each other's way constantly. We don't have that today with the Oilers and Blackhawks entering this game. But that being said, I'm certainly not pouring cold water on it. I'll watch the game. I'm curious to see, how Bedard in particular plays, and it's just kind of cool. I mean, let's face it, you don't get talents like that on the ice together every single night in 2 games, and I'm sure it's one that Bedard will remember. It's funny. I went down to Pittsburgh and covered, I think, a couple times when McDavid first played Crosby. Like, man, the torch keeps getting passed, and I just keep sitting up here in the press box getting a little grayer.
I was waiting for one of those. One more thing just before we get to sports interaction, just on the topic of McDavid versus Bedard. How much do you think the NHL needs that type of rivalry, a player versus player dynamic? Like the Crosby Ovechkin years, a lot of people, especially those who listen to the show, grew up in that era watching the Penguins and the Capitals battle each other in the playoffs, the dueling hat tricks in the playoffs. Remember that. How much do you think the league needs a player versus player type of rivalry?
Well, I don't think it hurts, right? I mean, it gives you something. If you're just a casual, if you're just someone who doesn't follow one team every game, or you're not watching 3 or 4 or 10 games a week of the NHL, but you find out that game's on, like, I think it does draw casual eyeballs. I also feel like it can't really be forced, though, and that's where it's tricky. Like, hard for me to be critical of the league or anything like that because we don't necessarily have something of that nature in this moment. I mean, let's face it, some of the things that work against hockey are kind of obvious. The players are wearing helmets. Like, you don't get to see their expressions quite as much. So you don't, again, if you're just casual, if you're not digging in and reading, these great 1,500 word stories on sites like The Athletic, like, you might not get to know all the stories behind the story. And I think basketball in some ways better lends itself to that. Obviously, just, the best basketball players are on the court for most, if not all, the game. There's just, so hockey, being a team sport, I think it's a little harder to play that up. But, I think that we should encourage individualism. I know we've been sort of consistent on that So that doesn't always mean, player X versus player Y, but I mean, at least I think that we should play up some of the aspects of the game beyond just the game. And, something like this will fall together naturally at some point in time, though. I don't, it's hard to know where it's going to be, but, like look at last year's Cup final, like Florida, Vegas, there's nothing between those cities that you could really amplify in a legitimate way. There's no individuals on the team where you're like, it's Aaron Ekblad versus Jack Eichel. Like there was nothing. I mean, they obviously spent time on the ice against each other in that series. Don't get me wrong, but it's I don't think you can fake it. Crosby Ovechkin is probably the closest that I can think of in my years in the league, just because they ended up playing in the same division. Their teams were both top teams for years and years and years, and so by virtue of the way that this playoff format works, they had to go through each other all the time. I think there's years there where Washington lost to Pittsburgh where they probably feel had they got through that round that they might have won a Stanley Cup sooner than they ultimately did. And that's the kind of rivalry, but I don't know how we can fake it unless we end up getting like, super teams in the NHL and players sort of taking advantage of their free agency and loading up like that. I'm not sure that we're ever going to have that fall into place just so. I think the biggest issue in Chicago right now when I look at it is they're a long way away from being a long way away. It feels like that's not on Connor Bedard. He's obviously done, an awesome job individually this season, playing with, not the strongest, teammates, facing tough competition. He still put up a lot of points and goals. We just need the team around him to get better as soon as possible. Cause it might, he might be the rare generational player that's got to wait a few years to play a playoff game. I mean, typically we've seen, the Penguins missed the playoffs in Crosby's first year and then made it for 16 years in a row after that before missing again last year. The Leafs got in with Matthews right away. They had other young players and a better supporting cast. McDavid, I think it was a couple years, but then, Edmonton's been a regular playoff team most of his career. It's going to be an uphill climb there, I think, for the Blackhawks, even with having Connor Bedard, just because they're starting from way back in the pack.
Isn't that all the more reason to hype up these regular season games, though?
Yeah, man, I'm all for the hype. Yeah. Sorry, I feel like maybe I didn't bring the hype man to this segment enough. I'm just thinking like it's just kind of a curiosity to me. I don't know how much it really matters in the grand scheme of things, but if they both get hat tricks on Tuesday night, that's probably still going to talk about. We're going to want to talk about this on Thursday again, right? So I mean, let's cheer for that. I'm not cheering for any team or even any individual in that game, but it would be great to see them both put on a show. I mean, that would be fun.